Good morning. This morning's scriptures will be read from Romans chapter 8, verses 18 through 27. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. The creation waits in eager expectation for the sons of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in its pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. But hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what he already has? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groans that words cannot express. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints in accordance with God's wills. May God bless this message and Dan's message.
Last Sunday night after the Faith to Life group, Don, on his way out, he asked me, he said, "So do you know what you're preaching on next week?" And, sometimes I know exactly what I'm preaching on the next week. And this particular week, I actually had 3 different options that I was thinking through. I'm like, what order do I want to do those sermons in? Now, my personal opinion, I think Don was just kind of fishing because he wanted to know whether he should tune in online or not. So I hope you're watching, Don. So I went to bed and I was like kind of mulling this over. I'm like, well, what order do I want to do those sermons in? Because I had several yet under this series, Who is God? And I went to bed last Sunday night and I woke up on Monday morning and I no more than woke up and I had the answer. And I was like, evil and suffering is this week. And incidentally, it's also next week. So just a heads up, 2-parter, right? And I was like, it made perfect sense. I'm like, we're going to hit this one, then we're going to hit this one, then we're going to hit this one. And I love it when God does that because I really didn't know which way I was going to go when I went to bed. And so then I do what I normally do on Mondays. I pack up all my stuff because I'm going to go to my secondary office. That's called Panera, for those of you who may not know, right? So I'm going to my secondary office, and on my way there, I've got the radio turned on, and it just happens to hit the news. And the first thing I hear going to Panera is 60 wounded and 5 dead in the Chicago shooting over the weekend. Now, the numbers were increased to, I think, 13 and 72, 13 dead and 72 wounded. And I thought, okay, God, I know why you want me to hit evil and suffering this week. Later in the day, I got a call from a friend, and a friend calls me up, and he says, I just found out that my brother-in-law died last night. So it turns out, and I won't give all the details, but him and his wife had moved. Within 10 days of moving into a new place, the place was hit by a hurricane. If that's not bad enough luck, right? And I don't know whether there was a time span between the two or not, but they were putting in some sod at the new place and stuff, and sod was delivered, and he was out and tripped, fell, and died. When we think about the topic of evil and suffering, it's a topic that hits all of us, isn't it? I remember when my own dad died, it was kind of an unexpected thing. And I remember the question that we asked, which is a question that I bet everybody sitting in this room have asked at some point in your life, and that was, why? Why, God? I expect all of us have asked that question at some point. Now, it may be that sometimes you've asked that question and somewhere along the way you found an answer. But I would also expect that there's been lots of times that you've asked that question and you're still waiting for the answer. Why, God? Because when we think about the problem of evil and suffering, no one is immune to the problem of evil and suffering. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when and to what degree. When and to what degree am I going to experience some kind of trial, some kind of pain, some kind of suffering? Polls suggest that the number one question that people ask is, why is there pain and suffering in the world? Number one question people ask, why? Now, the philosopher Epicurus, he presents the problem this way. He says, and I quote, either God wants to abolish evil and cannot, or he can but does not want to, or he cannot and does not want to. Don't you just love the way the philosophers talk? If he wants to but cannot, he is impotent. If he can and does not want to, he is wicked. But if God both can and wants to abolish evil, then how comes evil in the world? Now, the argument that he's making is a position that's stated in various ways by various atheists yet today, as they try to tell us and explain that the existence of evil emphatically rules out the reality of God. And that's the argument that they try to make, that the existence of evil rules out the existence of God. Now, today what we're going to show is how the existence of evil does not rule out the answer of God. And we're going to look at this week and next week as well. But we do need to wrestle with this question. It's like, if God is all wise and God is all powerful and God is all good, then why is there evil and suffering? Because after all, God should have been wise enough, right, to be able to create a world without evil and suffering. That's kind of how the reasoning goes. So let's dive in a little bit to see what is going on. Now, Lee Strobel, a Christian, summarizes the questions a little bit more to today's vernacular, right? So here's what Lee Strobel writes. He says, when we read stories of horrible evils like the Holocaust, the killing fields of Cambodia, the genocide of Rwanda, the torture chambers of South America, and we can't help but wonder, where is God? We watch television coverage of earthquakes and hurricanes in which thousands perish, and we wonder, why didn't God stop it? We read the statistic that 1,000 million people in the world lack the basic necessities of life, and we wonder, why doesn't God care? We may suffer ourselves with persistent pain or aching loss or seemingly hopeless circumstances, and we wonder, why doesn't God help? If he is loving and if he is all-powerful and if he is good, then surely all of this suffering should not exist. And yet it does. Paul begins the text that we read for today with, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. Now, when Paul talks about present sufferings here, it entails the range of sufferings that people experience. Now, when you think about the Apostle Paul experienced evil and suffering. So I'm not saying that the Apostle Paul didn't have evil and suffering inflicted upon him. But here he's not talking about specific to his unique circumstances. He says, when we consider the present sufferings for all the people of God, because really this is where the question gets really hard. It's not that it's just the wicked that suffer. In fact, sometimes the wicked prosper in this life. It's why does bad things happen to good people? That's where we really have a hang-up. That's where we really start running into problems. It's like, why? Why do bad things happen to good people? But when he talks about present sufferings, he's looking at the range of sufferings people experience. So we can talk about suffering caused by natural disasters, for instance. So that's suffering that hits righteous and unrighteous alike, natural disasters. You can talk about suffering that is the result of intentional human sinfulness. If you ever look at the history of the world, you will notice something about people. We're not always very nice to one another. But we can also talk about unintentional. Sometimes people hurt one another, and it's not because I did it on purpose. It's just because I'm selfish, I'm sinful, I made a mistake. I don't have a good brain in my head, right? So there's intentional, there's unintentional, and there's also the result of the fact that we live in a fallen world where there are such things as sickness and disease and death. So how do we answer all of these questions? Now, there are those who raise evil and suffering as the kind of that death toll for Christianity. But here's the problem. They want to say that the presence of evil and suffering eliminates the possibility of God, but they don't have an explanation for evil and suffering. And they don't have an explanation for where did life come from. And they don't have an explanation for where does morality come from. They don't have an explanation for how do we even begin to talk about evil and suffering if we also don't have some idea of good. You see, here's the problem for the atheist. Where does good come from? How do we account for all the goodness that we see? How do we account for the self-sacrifice and the love and the nobility and the courage that we also see in people? That's where they struggle to answer, because you don't get that from evolution. You don't get that from naturalistic thinking. So where do we find an explanation that answers the question of evil and suffering, but also life and morality and meaning and destiny? You know, when we think about this question of evil and suffering, it's not a question that kind of exists in a vacuum. Sometimes we kind of let's just deal with this right here and limit it to this one little piece. Well, it's a piece of a much larger picture. And part of the power of Christianity is not simply that it answers the question of evil and suffering, but it also answers all the cumulative evidence to speak about where did life come from? What's the meaning of life? Why do we have a sense of morality? What's right and what's wrong? What's good and what's evil? And destiny. Christianity has the power to explain all of these things, whereas all your other worldviews, they kind of fall short. They don't have a consistent answer that runs from one question to the next. Now, every worldview does have to deal with this question of evil and suffering. Mark Clark sums up some of these explanations, and this is just very general. He says, New Age teaches that it doesn't really exist. It's merely an illusion. Now, that also bleeds into some other religions as well. It's not just New Age, but so their take on evil and suffering is it's not really real, it's just an illusion. It's just a figment of your imagination. You ever want to say, what world are you living in, right? What world are you living in? Hinduism teaches that it's the result of karma, right? So there's good and bad from our past lives. So suffering in this life means you did something rotten in the last life. That's their answer. Now, the problem is you have no idea what rotten thing you did in the last life, and you have no way of working it out in this life. Because you know what? If I was rotten in that life, I'm also sinful in this life. So where does this cycle really end? If it's all about making up for my past wrongs. Atheism, their answer is bad things happen because there is no good God. That's atheism's answer. Bad things happen because there is no good God. Now, Douglas Gruthus, he has a book, it's like this thick, on apologetics. It's actually a pretty interesting read. I'm not sure if I read every page of it, but I at least read the sections that was pertinent for what I was dealing with at the time. But he has this chapter on evil and suffering, and in that chapter, he shows the logical fallacies in atheism and a finite God and a morally impaired God and a world without evil. That would be the illusion. The karma reincarnation argument. He shows the logical fallacies and shortcomings of each of these. And I don't want to dig into all the shortcomings of the other views, because I want to focus more on the answer that Christianity gives to show how Christianity deals with this particular issue. But I do want to just point out for the atheism, because atheists are the ones who dogmatically say that evil and suffering means that there is no God. And so I do want to kind of address that one a little bit, because what happens with atheism when they say, well, evil and suffering means there's no God, what they do is they ignore all the other cumulative evidence. There's a lot of evidence for the existence of God. And so they ignore all that evidence to say, well, we have a problem here with evil and suffering. But we don't want to deal with any of the other evidence. They ignore the evidence that we have in regard to the reliability of Scripture. If you want to talk about historical works, there is no book that stands up to historical scrutiny like this book does. No other book. The archaeology, the history, it's there. The evidence is there for the reliability of Scripture. Well, when you want to talk about the death and resurrection of Jesus, you can look at history. You can look at the arguments. You can look. There's so many reasons and so much evidence that's there. Now, we're not going to deal with all the evidence today because we've already done that, at least in part. They're all on the website. Go to networkbible.org. We spent like 9 weeks on the uniqueness of Jesus. We talked about the reliability of Scripture, the historical, the manuscript, why we can believe this is the Word of God. It's all there on the website. The point that I want to make is that this one question of evil and suffering does not provide this conclusive rebuttal for the cumulative evidence for God. Rather, when we think about evil and suffering, we have to understand it within the larger picture. In fact, here's part of the shortcoming in the atheist argument that says, because there's evil and suffering, there is no God. This is a quote from ethicist and atheist, okay? So I'm not appealing to a Christian philosopher, but an atheist philosopher, Richard Taylor, who says this: to say that something is wrong, even though no God exists to forbid it, is not understandable. To say that something is wrong, even though there's no God that exists to forbid it, is not understandable. You see, if we really want to talk about good and evil, it can't be defined by human preferences. We shared it in a Bible study this morning. Ravi Zacharias said it last week in the video. He basically says, if morality is defined by our interest and our preferences, then who's to say whether it's better to love your neighbor than to eat them? Because just because something's right for me doesn't mean it's right for you. Just because I define good in a certain way doesn't mean you define good in the same way that I do. He says the very fact that we can universally acknowledge that there's a category of morally evil means we also have to understand that there's a category of morally good that transcends, that is above simply human preference. As C.S. Lewis put it, a moral law implies that there's a moral law giver. David Wood, he kind of points out, and this is the argument he makes, he points out that for the atheist to even declare suffering as evil, they are at the same time helping us prove that God exists. Because a moral evil only exists if there's also a moral good which cannot be explained by means of evolution, naturalism, reason, or pragmatism, but only by the existence of God. This is the same point that was conceded by the atheist philosopher. We cannot really talk about something being right or wrong, good or bad, without some understanding of a God. So if Christianity offers the best explanation, which accounts for the cumulative evidence, then what is that? So we've already been talking about how we can't just look at evil as a snapshot. Rather, we have to have this more developed picture to see how it fits in and with all of the evidence. And as we look at all the evidence, what we're going to find is that a good, powerful, all-wise God, what he in fact does is doesn't eliminate the fact of evil and suffering that we deal with, but he has the ability to redeem and to restore. He has the ability to bring good, even out of the evil and suffering that we experience. And that's what we're going to take a couple of weeks to look at. So Hal Seed asked the question that many people ask, and it's probably perhaps a question that you've asked yourself, and that is, why didn't God create a world where there is no evil and suffering? You've probably asked that question before. Why didn't God create a world where there's no evil and suffering? Yesterday was up here, and we had a prison team meeting, and everybody gets to give their talk, and it gets critiqued and reviewed. And so others sit back and they listen to it, and they're like, you could have. You could have. Or this is something you could do. Or I liked it when you did this, but this is a little place of fine-tuning. Right? It's kind of like we're sitting back and we're saying, God, if I were you, this is how I would have done it. If I were, God, I think I've got a better plan here. It's like, I'm looking at the world. Well, if I were God, I would have made a world without evil and suffering, I think. God, that would have been such a beautiful place, a world without evil and suffering. Why wouldn't God create a world without evil and suffering? You want the short answer? He did. He did. Read Genesis 1. Read Genesis 2. It was good. It was good. It was good. I'll get to the point. It was very good. He did. The biblical account in Genesis presents God not as the author and creator of evil, but as Peter Kreeft highlights, God created the possibility of evil. People actualize that potentiality. What God created was good, but it also had the possibility of evil. So then the next place that your mind probably runs is, well, why God? Why didn't you just create a world without the possibility of evil, right? I'm reading your mind, aren't I? Why? Okay, so we understand you created the world good. Why didn't you create the world without the possibility of evil? Let's think that through just a minute. Without the possibility. You know what you just eliminated? Any freedom, any choice. If God removed all possibility of evil, you know what? I'm sorry, you just can't do that because even though you're not going to intend it, you're going to jump in that car and you're going to go out and you're going to fall asleep behind the wheel and you're going to have an accident. So I'm going to snap my fingers and you're not getting in that car. To take away the possibility is to take away the choice. If there's choice, there's also consequences. God created the world good, but there was the possibility of evil. Chuck Colson puts it this way. He says, and I quote, the introduction of evil's possibility is the condition of our being free and responsible, both the gift and the price of human dignity. Now, there's another corollary that sometimes we don't think about, and this is a little bit of a harder concept or to grasp, and that's also this reality. God's chief aim, this is going to be hard for some of you, so I hope you're ready for this. Fasten your seatbelts. God's chief aim is not your happiness. God's chief aim is not your happiness. It is your maturity. Maturity is defined by Christ's likeness, which ultimately brings glory and worship and praise to God. But God is not some cosmic genie sitting in heaven to make you happy and to fill your every pleasure and desire. And that's often how people want to treat God. And part of what we see is not only the fact that there has to be the possibility of evil for choice to exist. Before we can choose God, we also have the opportunity not to choose God. But as Douglas Gruthis and Peter Kreeft point out, the greatest virtues cannot be developed outside the elements of pain and suffering. Now, if you let this sink in just a little bit, think of a natural disaster. There are people who exploit natural disasters for their own benefit and their own good. But what else do you see with natural disasters? You see the best of people. You see people give and self-sacrifice and acts of heroism and love, and you see the best even as you see the worst. If you were to interview people around the world, my guess is that you'll find a very similar theme that kind of runs through the current of many of them. And what that theme will be is, the best lessons I've learned in life did not come from times of prosperity and blessing and when life was easy. The most valuable lessons that I learned came through trials and hardship and suffering. How many of you would like to pray for patience? I see some heads shaking no, right? Some hands going up. Some of you are like, I'm not so sure if I want to pray for this or not. You want to pray for patience, right? Here's the short answer to this, right? Don't pray for patience, because guess what God won't give you? He won't give you patience. He'll give you the circumstances in which patience grows. There are some virtues that cannot exist in a world without the possibility of evil and suffering. Things like courage and heroism, self-sacrifice, patience, and the highest form of love. You know what the most difficult love is? Not to love the lovely. The most difficult and highest love is to love the unlovely. So we also have this element, and this is kind of pointing us forward to a God who can bring a greater good out of evil and suffering. It's kind of pointing us forward in that direction of what an all-wise and all-powerful God is able to do. Peter Kraft writes, and I quote, "Certainly there are times when God allows suffering and deprives us of the lesser good of pleasure in order to help us toward the greater good of moral and spiritual education." We all love that education, don't we? Douglas Gruthers gives this insight as well. He says, "Evil has a secondary status in the universe. It is not a direct creation of God, but comes through human mismanagement of people and their environment. Nevertheless, some moral goods are impossible apart from responding to particular evils. Therefore, the fall," referring back to Genesis 3, "the fall, while based on human rebellion against a holy God, opens up possibilities for virtue not possible otherwise." He goes on to say that as evil serves as an instrumental good purpose in the providence of God. What he's saying is, even though we may not see the reason, that's not to say God doesn't have a reason we don't yet understand to bring a greater good. So what do we learn about evil and suffering from these few verses and how this fits in with the picture of an all-powerful God? Well, one of the first things we want to note is that present sufferings are not reflective of our future state as believers, nor was it part of the original design. Verse 18, he says, "I consider our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed." Don't miss the last part of that verse. Suffering doesn't have the last word. Evil doesn't have the last word. Our present sufferings are not worthy to be compared to the glory that will be revealed. And then he goes on, "For the creation was subjected to frustration." There was a point in history when creation was subjected to frustration. Depending on your translation, it might say futility, might say meaninglessness, I think is another translation. So there was something that happened that impacted all of creation. And that's where we see some of these things taking place. Now, I already mentioned that present sufferings reflects the ubiquitous nature. She's not even looking at me. So, insider story, that's the best thing I took away from seminary, that word ubiquitous. It means universal, something that's common to all. Common to all. So the ubiquitous or the universal nature and range of suffering that people may experience in this life, of which Paul is no stranger. Because when this question really gets complicated is, why do bad things happen to good people? Why do bad things happen to good people? Think about the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul gave his life literally for the proclamation of the gospel. Now, he had another history that we're not going to talk about right now, right? Because we also see the grace and forgiveness in the life of Paul and the early, right? And he encountered Jesus and he gave his life. I mean, nobody can say that they were as resolute and as determined to serve the purposes of God as Paul. And what was the result of that resoluteness to serve God? He was imprisoned, he was flogged, he was exposed to death again and again and again and again and again and again. We could probably say, and again. 5 times received 40 lashes minus 1. That's because they believed 40 would kill a man, so they were limited to 39. 3 times beaten with rods, stoned, shipwrecked 3 times. And he goes on to mention other dangers encountered. That's all in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, so you can read it for yourself. And then you come into 2 Corinthians chapter 12, where Paul talks about the thorn in the flesh. And with the thorn in the flesh, he says, I entreated God 3 times, take this away from me, and God said no. said, my grace is sufficient, and my strength will be perfected in your weakness. You know, few people have encountered evil and suffering such as Paul. But rather than becoming a stumbling block, it became a catalyst for greater faith. In fact, that's what you find in our world today, is the ones who raise evil and suffering as a problem against God are not the ones typically experiencing the evil and suffering. It's the people who are on the outside looking in. Because what they don't recognize that the people who are going through it do is, you know what? God has revealed himself in significant ways through the evil and through the suffering. Because what we do have is a God who is present with us in the suffering, which is something very contrary to any other worldview. A God who walks with us through the suffering. You know, the problem of evil and suffering is not only not a rock-solid case against God, but as Philip Yancey observed, as I visited with people whose pain far exceeded my own, I was surprised by its effects. Suffering seemed as likely to reinforce faith as to sow agnosticism. So if you look at the promise, he says, suffering was not part of creation at the beginning, nor will it be anything compared to the glory revealed in the end. Suffering will not have that final word. And rather than a God who created evil, we see a God who is wise enough and powerful enough and good enough to bring meaning even from evil and suffering and glory to himself. So where did it all come from? Well, then we go back to verses 20 and 21. For the creation was subjected to frustration. We started pointing to this earlier. He points back to an incident that happened in history. This is what we call the fall. This is where people chose willingly to reject God. And when you look at the fall, it introduced evil and suffering that not only afflicted everyone, but everything. Creation itself was subjected and to decay, he says, and to bondage and to decay. Douglas Gruthus writes, the doctrine of the fall preserves both the original goodness of creation and the goodness of God as the creator. This is because the fall explains evil, not on the basis of intrinsic properties of creation, nor on the bad intent of God, but according to the rebellious wills of God's human creatures. So he continues on in verses 22 through 25. We know that the whole creation has been groaning, as in the pains of childbirth, right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. The hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what he already has? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. And we have this picture of creation itself as groaning, so it affects not just everyone, but everything. And I love the illustration he uses, as in pains of childbirth. Isn't that an interesting metaphor to use? Groans is in the pains of childbirth. I'm not going to pretend to speak from a woman's perspective on this. Thank you. But on the other side of the pain is a greater good. That's the same point that's being made through the scriptures. That even through the pain, God can bring a greater good. A joy that far exceeds the evil and the suffering that was experienced. It's a powerful image. And he speaks in these verses of waiting and of hope. Now, unfortunately, we're not always given an explanation for suffering. But what we are given is the promised presence of God. He says the first fruits of the Spirit. He comes down later to talk about how in our weakness, the Spirit prays for us and intercedes for us. We're promised the presence of God, even if we're not promised the elimination of suffering, because the difference in suffering is not in the who, but it's in the how. The righteous and the unrighteous alike suffer. The difference is in how we endure. And whether we're going to do it with the presence of God or without the presence of God, whether we're going to do it as a people with hope, whose trust is in God and who knows that suffering is not the last word. In fact, when it comes down to the word of patience in verse 25, it's translated in some translations as perseverance or patient endurance, because it's not a word that just means, I'm just going to sit idly by and let life happen to me. It's a word that means, despite the trials and the hardships, I'm going to keep pressing forward because I know where my trust is and I know what my hope is. So I'm going to keep moving forward. And the reason why we can say, speak of hope as something beyond just this wishful thinking is because God has this tendency to take what appears to be meaningless suffering at the time, that appears to be pointless at the time, that appears to have no reason at the time, only to show us that it has meaning and purpose and reason. You want me to give you an illustration? How do you think the disciples felt when Jesus was arrested and tried and flogged and beaten and spit upon and nailed to a cross? They felt this is pointless, this is meaningless, there's no reason for this, he doesn't deserve this isn't right, this isn't fair, this isn't justice. Anything that you can imagine going through, and you, as you ask that question, why, they were going through that. Until when? Until they discovered the resurrection. Just because they didn't know the reason didn't mean there wasn't a reason. Just because they didn't see the purpose didn't mean there wasn't a purpose. And it didn't mean that a greater good wouldn't come. The problem with evil and suffering is that we seldom can see the reason for it until we see what God brings from it. And at times, we will not see that on this side of glory. Sometimes we will, but sometimes we will not see that on this side of glory. So Paul writes, who hopes for what he already has? Because we may not see the good today, we may not have the answer today, but we know it's coming. And so we press on, knowing that God may have reasons that we don't know of. Verses 26 and 27 continue, in the same way the Spirit helps in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for. I've been there. Have you been there? We do not know what to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groans that words cannot express. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints in accordance with the will of God. You know, it's a faulty premise that evil and suffering are incompatible with the loving, all-powerful God. Because an infinite God who has all wisdom, it just may be possible that he has reasons we don't understand. I'm just saying. It may just be possible that he has reasons we don't understand. You know, we have a dog at home, and I know we're not the only ones with a pet. I know some of you others have pets too. And our dog happens to have allergies. And then he also happens to be on medications that, you know, like heartworm pill and stuff for ticks and fleas and stuff. You know, things that are for his good. But you know, however good those pills are for him, he doesn't want to take them. In fact, he's a very smart little dog. You can wrap that pill in cheese or in meat, and you can put all sorts of things around it, and you know he'll just eat everything around that pill and spit it out. Why? Because he doesn't like it. And he doesn't see the good in it. And it doesn't matter how hard we say, Jack, this is good for you. Jack, this is for your benefit. Jack, this is to keep you healthy. Jack, this is to keep you from itching and scratching. It doesn't matter how much we try to explain it, he will never understand it. He doesn't have the capacity to. Just because we don't always see the reason doesn't mean an explanation isn't there. God didn't create evil and suffering, but he did create its possibility. And he does work through it in ways that beyond our comprehension to bring a greater good that we're not always able to see and not always able to understand. It's only when we're on the other side, such as the resurrection, able to look back that we can begin to see sometimes. If God can take the greatest of evils, I'm sorry, I think I forgot to give you that one tonight. Reasons that we're not always able to comprehend. If God can take the greatest of evils, the crucifixion of his son, and bring from that the greatest of goods, not only our redemption, but the redemption of creation itself, then it seems to reason, as Randy Alcorn points out, that, I quote, just because we cannot see any purpose for evil and suffering does not mean no explanation exists. Just a fun question. How many of you liked algebra? Few hands went up. I see less hands than I see more. I see more hands down. For those of you who did not raise your hand, did you ever have that experience in high school where you're going through algebra and you're taking this class that they made you take? And you had the thought, when am I ever going to use this in life? And yet look at how much in our world is dependent on math and algebra. Just because you don't see the purpose doesn't mean it's not there. And that's the testimony that Scripture gives us. We're not always going to see the purpose. God is smarter than you are. God is smarter than I am. We're not always going to see his purposes, but it doesn't mean that they're not there. And while the cross doesn't explain to us all suffering, it does remind us that we have a God who walks with us through it, and a God who has the wisdom and the power to redeem and to restore and to bring a greater good even from the evil and the suffering. And so as the text points out, we wait eagerly for our adoption as sons, for the redemption of our bodies, because we likewise will discover one day as believers in Jesus Christ, as verse 18 says, that our present sufferings are not worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed. Amen.